Have you ever felt it? That moment, right before you open your mouth to speak in English, where your heart starts racing, your palms get a little sweaty, and suddenly every single word you've ever learned in your entire life just disappears? Like your brain just went completely blank, and all you can think is, please don't let me mess this up. Please don't let me say the wrong thing. Please don't let everyone stare at me like I just said something ridiculous. Yeah, we know that feeling. We know it really well.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Bruce.
And I'm Lily, and today we are diving into something that honestly we should have talked about a long time ago, because this is not just an English learning problem. This is a deeply human problem, and it affects learners at every single level, from complete beginners all the way to advanced speakers who have been studying English for years and years.
That's right. Today, we are talking about the fear of making mistakes in public, the fear of stumbling over your words, the fear of mispronouncing something in front of native speakers, the fear of using the wrong grammar and watching someone's eyes flicker with that tiny little look of confusion, or worse, amusement.
And here is what makes today's conversation so exciting and honestly a little bit mind-bending, because we are going to flip everything you think you know about mistakes completely upside down. Because what if I told you that the thing you are most afraid of, the mistake, the stumble, the mispronunciation, the awkward pause, what if that thing is actually the most powerful tool in your entire English learning journey?
What if trying to speak perfectly is the one thing that is actually holding you back from becoming a truly confident, natural communicator?
We're going to prove that to you today, and we're going to do it with real stories, real strategies, real science, and a whole lot of honesty. Because Bruce and I, we have made some truly spectacular, cringeworthy, unforgettable linguistic mistakes in public, and we are going to tell you all about them.
Oh, we are absolutely going to tell you about them. I still think about one particular incident in a coffee shop and yeah, we'll get to that.
We will definitely get to that. So here is what we have lined up for you today. We are going to start by talking about the trap of perfectionism, why so many of us fall into it, and why it is so incredibly dangerous for your fluency. Then we are going to bust wide open what we call the myth of the textbook standard, because the English you learned in the classroom and the English people actually use every day, two very different things.
Then we're going to get personal, really personal, and share some of our greatest linguistic failures, the moments that felt like absolute disasters. And then we're going to show you exactly what happened after those disasters, because that's where the magic is.
After that, we're going to give you something we call the resilience protocol, specific, practical techniques you can start using today, right now, to recover mid-sentence, to reframe your mistakes, and to actually start enjoying the process of getting things wrong.
And we'll close out by talking about what it really means to master fluid communication. And spoiler alert, it has a lot less to do with perfect vocabulary and a lot more to do with something much more powerful.
Stay with us, because this conversation, it could completely change the way you approach English, and honestly, the way you approach communication in any language, in any situation, for the rest of your life. So let's get into it.
All right, Lily, let's start at the very beginning. Let's start with the trap, because I think before we can talk about how to overcome the fear of making mistakes, we really need to understand where that fear comes from. We need to understand why it feels so intense, so paralyzing, so real.
Yes, and I love that you called it a trap, Bruce, because that is exactly what it is. It is not just nervousness, it is not just shyness, it is an actual psychological trap. And once you understand the mechanics of the trap, you become so much better at escaping it.
So let's start here. Let's talk about high-stakes environments, because the fear of making mistakes is not equally distributed across all situations, right? Like, most people feel slightly nervous about speaking English in any public situation, but there are certain environments where that fear spikes dramatically, where it goes from a low hum of anxiety to a full, heart-pounding, throat-tightening moment of terror.
Exactly. And these are what we call high-stakes environments. And the reason they feel so threatening, the reason your nervous system reacts so strongly, is because of something called the fear of instant judgment.
The fear of instant judgment. Let's break that down because it's a fascinating concept. When you're in a high-stakes environment, let's say you're in a job interview, or you're presenting something to a group, or you're meeting your partner's family for the first time, or you're trying to speak to a customer at work, your brain does something very interesting. It activates what psychologists call a social threat response.
And this is a very old, very ancient part of your brain. We're talking about survival instincts that go back thousands and thousands of years. Because for our ancestors, being judged negatively by the group, being seen as different, as less capable, as not belonging, that was genuinely dangerous. It could mean being excluded from the tribe. And exclusion from the tribe back then literally meant not surviving.
So your brain, even in 2026, even when you are simply trying to order a coffee in English or introduce yourself at a networking event, your brain still treats social judgment as a form of threat. It fires off the same alarm systems. It releases the same stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, your heart rate increases, your breathing gets shallow, and your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for clear thinking, language processing, and creative problem solving, it gets partially shut down.
And that is why your mind goes blank. That is the biology of the blank mind. It is not that you forgot your English. It is that your brain is in survival mode and has temporarily redirected its resources away from language and towards self-protection.
Which, when you think about it, is almost funny, because the very moment you need your language skills the most, the high-stakes moment, the important conversation, that is exactly when your brain makes it hardest to access them.
It's like trying to drive a car at the exact moment the engine is under the most stress. Things start to stutter, things start to fail, and you panic even more, which makes it even worse.
And this leads us to the second really important point about the trap of perfectionism, which is the psychological drain of editing your thoughts before you speak. This one, I think, is something that a lot of English learners experience but don't have words for. So let me describe it, and tell me if this sounds familiar.
Please, yes, describe it.
So you're in a conversation. Someone has said something to you, you want to respond. And instead of just responding, instead of just letting words come out naturally, you start running a very complicated background process in your head. You're thinking, okay, how do I want to say this? What's the best word? Is the grammar right? Is the tense correct? Am I going to mispronounce that? What if they don't understand me? Should I simplify what I want to say? Should I just nod and pretend I agree so I don't have to speak?
Oh my goodness, yes, I know exactly what you're describing. And here's what makes it so exhausting, because it is a dual process, isn't it? You are simultaneously trying to understand what the other person is saying, formulate your own response, translate it into English, check it for errors, predict how it will be received, and decide whether to send it, all at the same time, all in real time, while maintaining eye contact and trying to look relaxed.
While looking relaxed. Right, which is the most ironic part, because you are doing the cognitive equivalent of running a marathon while also trying to look like you're casually strolling in the park.
And psychologists have a name for this. They call it cognitive overload. And the perfectionism loop, the constant internal editing, the constant checking and rechecking of your own language before you let it out, It is one of the single biggest drivers of cognitive overload in language learners.
Think of it this way. Your brain has a certain amount of processing power available at any given moment. Let's say it's 100 units of mental energy. A normal native speaker in a conversation, they might spend about 20 of those units on the actual mechanics of speech, the words, the grammar, the pronunciation. The other 80 units are free for things like listening, thinking creatively, making connections, being funny, being empathetic.
But a perfectionist English learner, they might spend 60, 70, even 80 of those units just on the internal editing process, checking, double-checking, worrying, revising. That leaves almost nothing left for the actual connection, for really listening, for responding authentically, for enjoying the conversation.
And the result is that your English actually sounds worse, not better. Because even if the words you finally choose are grammatically correct, they come out stilted. They come out stiff. They come out with no rhythm, no flow, no personality. And people can feel that. They can feel the tension in your speech. And paradoxically, it makes the conversation less comfortable for everyone.
Which brings us to the third piece of the perfectionism trap, and this one is the one that I think is the most insidious, the most hidden, the most damaging, and that is how the obsession with being flawless actually stunts your natural cognitive processing.
Let's sit with this one for a second, because this is really important.
It is. So here's what happens when you are constantly trying to be perfect, when you are constantly monitoring and correcting yourself, when every sentence you produce has to pass through a rigorous internal quality check before it is allowed to exit your mouth.
What happens?
You stop developing your intuition. You stop developing your feel for the language. Because here's the thing, fluency is not a logical process. Fluency is not about consciously knowing grammar rules and then applying them one by one in real time. Fluency is about having internalized the patterns of a language so deeply that they become automatic, so natural, so instinctive, that you don't have to think about them. They just happen.
Like driving a car. When you first learn to drive, you are thinking about everything. You're thinking about when to press the clutch, when to check the mirror, how far to turn the wheel, how much pressure to apply to the brake. It's overwhelming. But after years of driving, you just drive. You think about where you're going, not how you're operating the vehicle. The mechanics become invisible.
And language works the exact same way. Natural cognitive processing in language means that your brain is building and refining automatic pathways, neural shortcuts, through repeated use and through exposure. Every time you hear a phrase used naturally, every time you use it yourself, those pathways get a little stronger, a little faster, a little more automatic.
But perfectionism interferes with this process in a really specific way. Because when you are obsessively monitoring and correcting yourself, when you are always catching yourself and pulling back and editing, you are constantly interrupting the process of automatization. You are breaking the very neural pathways that fluency is built on.
It's like trying to build a path through a forest. But every time someone starts to walk down it and wear it down naturally, you sweep it away and say, no, that's not the perfect path. We need to find a better route first. And so the path never gets built. The ground never gets worn smooth.
That is such a perfect analogy. And there is actually research that supports this. There's a concept in language acquisition called the affective filter hypothesis, developed by linguist Stephen Krashen. And the idea is that when learners experience high levels of anxiety, self-consciousness, or fear, it raises what Krashen calls the affective filter. And a high affective filter acts like a wall. It literally blocks the input from reaching the parts of the brain that are responsible for language acquisition.
So the higher your anxiety, the less effectively your brain can absorb and internalize language. Which means that perfectionism, which is driven by anxiety, actually reduces your ability to learn. It makes you less efficient at the very thing you are trying to achieve.
It's a trap within a trap. You want to be perfect, so you get anxious. The anxiety raises your affective filter. The high affective filter slows down your acquisition. You don't improve as fast as you want, so you become even more anxious and even more desperate to be perfect. And around you go.
And the only way out of this trap, the only escape, is not to become more careful. It is not to study harder or to review your grammar rules more thoroughly. The way out is to deliberately, consciously, courageously decide to let go, to allow yourself to be imperfect, to allow yourself to make mistakes in public and to survive them and to learn from them.
Which I know sounds terrifying, especially when you've been in the trap for a long time, when perfectionism has become your default way of approaching language. It feels like you're being asked to jump off a cliff.
It does feel like that. But here's what I want you to hold on to as we move through the rest of this conversation. That cliff, it's not nearly as high as it looks. And the water at the bottom, it's warmer than you think. And once you jump, and once you come back up to the surface, you realize you can swim. And it feels incredible.
But before we get to the jumping part, I think we need to talk about something that is quietly feeding the perfectionism trap without most people even realizing it. And that's what we call the myth of the textbook standard. And Lily, this is one of my absolute favorite topics.
Oh, I know it is.
Because once you understand this, it changes everything. So don't go anywhere, because this next section, it might be the most liberating thing you hear all day.
Okay, Bruce, I'm excited about this one too, because I think so many English learners are quietly suffering under the weight of a standard that was never real in the first place. And that's exactly what the myth of the textbook standard is all about.
Let me paint a picture for you. Imagine that you have been learning English for a few years. Maybe you studied it in school. Maybe you've been taking classes. Maybe you've been using apps. And in all of that time, you have been taught a very specific version of English, a clean, formal, carefully structured version of the language.
A version where every sentence has a clear subject, verb, and object, where you never start a sentence with and or but, where contractions are used sparingly, where slang is avoided, where every question follows a perfect interrogative structure, where grammar rules are followed with almost mathematical precision.
And your teachers told you, or at least implied, that this is the correct English, that this is the English you should aim for, that anything that deviates from this standard is lesser, is incorrect, is something to be ashamed of.
And you absorbed that. Of course you did. You were a student. You wanted to do well. You wanted to get the right answer. And the right answer was always the clean, textbook correct sentence.
But then something happened. Maybe you watched a YouTube video made by native speakers, or you listened to a podcast, or you watched a TV show or a movie, or maybe you had a real conversation with someone who grew up speaking English, and you noticed something very strange.
They weren't speaking textbook English.
Not even close. They were dropping syllables. They were using contractions you didn't know existed. They were throwing in phrases that no dictionary seemed to contain. They were interrupting each other and finishing each other's sentences. They were starting sentences and abandoning them halfway through and starting over in a completely different direction.
They were saying things like gonna and wanna and lemme and kinda and sorta and you know and like and I mean and right. And these words and phrases and fillers were everywhere. Constant, natural, effortless.
And here's the thing. Native speakers weren't doing this because they were being sloppy or careless or lazy. They were communicating perfectly. They were conveying their ideas with warmth, with personality, with humor, with nuance. They were connecting with each other beautifully. And they were doing it with language that your textbook would have marked with a big red correction.
So what gives? Why is there such a massive gap between the English that is taught in classrooms and the English that is actually used in the real world? And what does this gap have to do with the fear of making mistakes?
Great question. And the answer starts with understanding something fundamental about language, something that a lot of formal education gets wrong. And that is this. Language is not a fixed system of rules. Language is a living, breathing, constantly evolving form of human expression.
Grammar rules. The rules you learned in your textbook, they are not laws of nature. They are not like the laws of physics, which are constant and universal and unchanging. Grammar rules are more like guidelines, conventions, agreements that communities of speakers make and then, over time, quietly revise and renegotiate.
And those conventions change. They change all the time. They change across different regions, they change across different generations, they change across different social contexts. The English that is considered perfectly acceptable in a casual conversation between friends is very different from the English you might use in a formal business email, and both are correct, both are appropriate in their respective contexts.
Let me give you a really concrete example of this. The sentence, "Who did you give it to?" In traditional textbook grammar, this would be marked as slightly incorrect. The correct version would be, "To whom did you give it?" Formal, precise, following a rule about ending sentences with prepositions.
But when was the last time you heard anyone, any real living human being in a real conversation, say, "To whom did you give it?" unless they were being deliberately formal or perhaps a little bit theatrical?
Almost never, right? Because "who did you give it to" is how actual human beings speak. It's natural, it flows, it sounds like a real person. And "to whom did you give it," while grammatically pristine, sounds stiff. It sounds like someone is reading from a legal document.
And native speakers, every single day, in every conversation, they prioritize rhythm and intent over perfect syntax. Let's really unpack that, because it is so important. What do we mean by rhythm?
Rhythm in speech is about how words flow together. It's about the music of language. Native speakers of English have an incredibly strong sense of the rhythm of the language, and they will actually bend or break a grammar rule if it makes the sentence feel more natural, more fluid, more rhythmically satisfying.
Think about the way native speakers use they as a singular pronoun. For years, for decades, grammar textbooks would tell you this is incorrect. If you don't know someone's gender, you say he or she, or he/she. But in real spoken English, people have been using they as a singular for centuries. Someone left their umbrella in the lobby. Can you let them know? Nobody is confused by this. Nobody thinks you're talking about multiple people. The meaning is perfectly clear. The rhythm is natural.
And grammar guides have now caught up with reality. Most modern style guides, including major ones, now formally accept singular they, because language evolves. The descriptive reality of how people actually speak eventually overwrites the prescriptive rules of how people were told they should speak.
And then there's intent. Native speakers prioritize intent, communicating what they actually mean over technical correctness. And this is so important for English learners to understand, because so much of the anxiety around making mistakes comes from the belief that if you use the wrong word or the wrong tense, people won't understand you, that communication will break down.
But the truth is that human beings are remarkably good at understanding intent even through imperfect language. If you say, "Yesterday I go to the store," instead of "Yesterday I went to the store," your listener understood you perfectly. They know you mean the past. The word "yesterday" already told them that. The imperfect past tense did not break down the communication. It was a tiny linguistic blip that the listener barely registered.
And this is actually confirmed by research in communication theory. Studies consistently show that in conversational speech, listeners rely primarily on context, intonation, and vocabulary to understand meaning, and they rely much less on perfect grammatical structure than most people assume.
In other words, your meaning comes through even when your grammar doesn't. And the best communicators in the world, the people who are most magnetic, most engaging, most effective in conversation, they understand this intuitively. They focus on what they want to say and trust that the words will carry it, even if the structure isn't perfect.
Now, there's another dimension to this that I want to bring in because we are living in 2026 and the world of communication has changed dramatically, and it has changed in ways that are deeply relevant to English learners and to this fear of making mistakes.
Oh, yes. Let's talk about this. Because the rise of AI-driven translation and communication tools has genuinely shifted the bar for human communication in ways that I don't think we fully reckoned with yet.
So let's think about this. As recently as a decade ago, if you wanted to have a business conversation in English with someone in another country, if you wanted to send a professional email or participate in a conference call, you needed a fairly high level of formal, grammatically correct English. Because the alternative, a rough, imperfect attempt at English, could lead to misunderstandings. It could seem unprofessional. It could create real friction.
But in 2026, the world looks very different. AI-powered translation tools are now extraordinarily sophisticated. Real-time translation exists. Email composition assistants can clean up your grammar instantly. AI meeting transcription tools can capture conversations in one language and produce accurate summaries in another. The technical barriers to communication across languages have dropped dramatically.
Which means something really interesting has happened. The primary value of a human being communicating in a second language has shifted. It used to be that the primary value was accuracy, being understood, conveying correct information. But now, the accuracy part can be handled, or at least substantially assisted, by technology.
So, what do human beings bring to the table that technology cannot replicate as easily? They bring warmth, they bring personality, they bring humor, they bring empathy, they bring authenticity. They bring the ability to read a room, to sense what someone really needs to hear, to communicate not just information, but connection.
And all of those things, warmth, personality, humor, empathy, authenticity, all of those are actually diminished by perfectionism, by overly cautious, overly formal, overly corrected speech, because those qualities require freedom, they require spontaneity, they require the willingness to say something imperfect because it's genuine.
So, in a world where AI handles the precision, the human value lies in the imprecision, in the genuine, unpolished, slightly messy quality of real human expression. Which means that in 2026, the pressure to speak with textbook perfection is actually lower than it has ever been in the history of English language learning, not higher.
And yet, and this is the fascinating, frustrating irony, so many learners feel more pressure now than ever before, because they're comparing themselves not just to native speakers, but to AI. They've heard perfectly grammatical, perfectly pronounced AI-generated English, and they think, I can never sound like that.
But you don't need to sound like that. An AI can produce flawless grammar, but it cannot replace the magic of two human beings genuinely connecting in conversation. It cannot replace the laugh that breaks out when someone makes an unexpected joke. It cannot replace the warmth of someone who is trying their best, not because they have to, but because they care about the person they're talking to.
And that is the truth about the textbook standard. It was always a myth. It was always an approximation of language, not language itself. And in 2026, in a world of increasingly sophisticated AI communication tools, the myth is even more irrelevant than it's ever been. What matters now, what has always mattered really, is connection, is presence, is genuine human expression.
And you can have all of those things even with imperfect English. Actually, especially with imperfect English. Because there is something incredibly charming and relatable about a person who is clearly trying, who is putting themselves out there, who is reaching across a language barrier, because the person on the other side is worth the effort.
Okay, I want to pause here for a moment because I think this is actually the perfect time to check in with you, our listener. Are you nodding along to any of this? Are you recognizing yourself in what we're describing? The internal editing, the textbook perfectionism, the gap between what you learned and what you hear in real conversations?
If any of this feels familiar, if you've ever held back from speaking because you weren't sure if your English was good enough, then we want you to know something. You are not alone. This is the most common struggle that English learners face worldwide. It doesn't matter what your first language is. It doesn't matter whether you're learning English in school, at work, for travel, for love, for family. This fear is universal.
And we know it is universal because we have felt it ourselves, both of us. And in just a moment, we are going to tell you about some of our most embarrassing, most uncomfortable, most genuinely horrible moments of English in public. Because we think that hearing our stories, hearing that even the people who now run an English learning channel have experienced spectacular linguistic failures, might make you feel a little less alone and a lot more hopeful.
So stay with us, because our greatest linguistic failures are coming up next. And I promise you, they are truly spectacular.
Okay, so this is the moment of truth. This is where Lily and I get genuinely vulnerable with you. And I want to say something before we start. The reason we're sharing these stories is not for entertainment, although honestly, some of them are pretty entertaining in retrospect. The reason we're sharing them is because we genuinely believe that hearing real stories of real mistakes, told with honesty and even some humor, is one of the most powerful things we can offer you as English learners.
Because so much of what you see and hear from people who teach English, from fluent speakers, from successful communicators, it's the polished version. It's the highlight reel. Nobody shows you the bloopers. Nobody stands up and says, "Here are all the times I got it completely wrong." And because of that, learners sometimes feel like fluent speakers were born speaking perfectly, like they never went through the messy middle.
But we did. We absolutely went through the messy middle. And the messy middle is not something to be ashamed of. It is something to be celebrated. Because the messy middle is where the real learning happens.
All right, Bruce. You mentioned a coffee shop incident earlier. I think we need to start there.
Oh, why did I bring that up? Okay, fine. The coffee shop. So this happened to me a number of years ago. I was at a stage in my English learning where I felt reasonably confident. I had been studying for a while. I could hold a basic conversation. I was feeling pretty good about myself.
Famous last words.
Famous. Last words. So I walk into this coffee shop. It's a busy morning. There's a line of people behind me. And the barista, this incredibly cheerful young woman, she takes my order and then she asks me a question. She says, "Can I get a name for the order?"
Simple question.
Completely simple question. And I knew what she was asking. She wanted my name for the cup. Standard procedure. I have done this before. And I opened my mouth to say my name.
And?
And what came out was not my name. What came out was, and I still do not fully understand how this happened. I said, "Yes, please."
You said yes, please, when she asked for your name?
I said, "Yes, please," as if she had offered me something. As if, "Can I get a name for the order?" was a yes or no question, as if I was confirming that, yes, I would indeed like to have a name.
Oh, Bruce.
And the barista, bless her heart, she just looked at me for a second, and I could see her processing it. And then she very kindly and very gently said, so what's your name?" And I stood there, and the people behind me in line were very much present, and I could feel my entire face turning red. And I said my name, and she wrote it on the cup. And I went and stood in the corner and waited for my coffee and wished I could become invisible.
That is incredible. That is genuinely one of the most relatable things I have ever heard. Because the thing is, you knew what she was asking. Your brain just short-circuited.
Completely. And that is exactly what happens when the social pressure spikes. Even when you know the answer, even when the situation is simple, the pressure can cause a kind of linguistic glitch where your brain sends the wrong signal. It's not a vocabulary problem. It's not a grammar problem. It's an anxiety problem.
And what happened after you got your coffee? Did you feel destroyed? Did you go home and decide to never speak English in public again?
For about 30 seconds, yes. Honestly, I stood there holding my coffee, and the first thought was, okay, I am clearly terrible at this, and I should go home. And then a slightly more rational part of my brain kicked in, and I thought, wait, what actually just happened? The barista got my order right, she eventually got my name, my coffee got made, the interaction was completed successfully. The only thing that happened was 30 seconds of awkwardness.
And how many people in that coffee shop do you think are still thinking about that moment today?
Approximately 0. Almost certainly 0. Because it was a tiny moment in the middle of a busy morning for everyone else there. For me, it felt enormous. It felt like a spotlight was shining on me and everyone in the room was watching and judging. But for everyone else, it was just a slightly confused customer, a blip, something that was forgotten in approximately 10 seconds.
And that is such a perfect real-life illustration of what psychologists call the spotlight effect. I want to talk about this because I think it is one of the most useful concepts for anyone who struggles with the fear of public mistakes.
Yes, please explain this, Lily, because I think it's something that every English learner needs to hear.
So, the spotlight effect is a cognitive bias, a systematic way that our brains get things wrong, that was first described by psychologists Thomas Gilovich and Kenneth Savitsky in the late 1990s. And the core idea is this: we consistently overestimate how much other people notice us. We believe that we are under a kind of constant spotlight, that other people are watching us, observing us, evaluating us far more than they actually are.
And this makes intuitive sense, right? Because each of us is the center of our own experience. We are always aware of ourselves, always aware of what we're doing and how we appear. So it feels like others must also be very aware of us.
But they're not, because every other person in the room is also the center of their own experience. They're also caught up in their own thoughts, their own worries, their own preoccupations. They are not, in fact, watching you. They're not cataloging your mistakes. They have their own spotlight on themselves.
Gilovich and Savitsky ran a fascinating experiment to demonstrate this. They had participants wear a t-shirt with an embarrassing image on it, and they asked the participants to guess what percentage of people in the room had noticed the shirt. Participants consistently overestimated. They thought far more people had noticed than had actually done so. Even when something was right there, visible, embarrassing, people still weren't paying as much attention as the wearer assumed.
And the application to language mistakes is enormous. When you mispronounce a word in a conversation, you feel it like a thunderclap. It feels like the whole room heard it, like everyone froze, like eyebrows were raised and notes were being mentally taken. But the reality? Most people didn't even register it. Or if they did, they registered it for approximately 1 second and then moved on with the conversation.
Because they're not listening for your mistakes. They're listening for your meaning. They're following the content of what you're saying. They're thinking about what they want to say next. They are not sitting there with a grammar checklist ticking off your errors.
Unless, of course, they are a particularly unkind person, and those people do exist, but they are much rarer than the fear center of your brain would have you believe. And even when they do notice and judge, their judgment says infinitely more about them than it does about you. A person who feels superior to someone for making a grammar mistake in their second language is not a person whose opinion is worth your anxiety.
Hear, hear. Now, Lily, I've shared my coffee shop disaster. It's your turn. Give us a story.
Oh, I have many, but I'll share the one that I think is the most instructive and also the most mortifying.
Excellent.
So this happened when I was in a situation where I needed to make a formal presentation in English in front of a group of people who were significantly more fluent than I was. And I had prepared. I had really, truly prepared. I had written out what I wanted to say. I had practiced. I had rehearsed in front of a mirror. I was ready.
So what happened?
I walked in. I got up in front of the group. I started speaking. And for the first maybe 2 minutes, it was actually going okay. I was nervous, but I was managing. And then I arrived at a moment in my presentation where I wanted to say the word specifically.
Such a reasonable word.
Such a reasonable word. A perfectly ordinary adverb. And I completely, catastrophically could not say it. My mouth got tangled, and instead of specifically, what came out was a sound. I genuinely cannot reproduce it for you because I am not sure it belongs to any language. It was something between specifically, and something entirely new that I may have invented on the spot.
No.
And I said it not once, but twice, because the first time I thought, maybe I can recover and say it again correctly. And the second time was somehow even worse. And then I just stopped. I stood there, in front of everyone, and there was silence.
What did you do?
I did something that, in the moment, felt like a desperate improvisation, but that turned out to be the best possible response. I laughed. I genuinely, authentically laughed, and I said, you know what? That word is not cooperating with me today. In particular, I mean that one specifically. And I pointed to the word on my slide and laughed again, and the room laughed with me. And then I just continued. I moved on. I finished the presentation.
And that laugh, that genuine moment of self-awareness, I would argue that's the moment that actually made the presentation memorable for the right reasons.
That's exactly right. And I discovered something in that moment that I have carried with me ever since, which is this. The way you respond to a mistake in public is infinitely more important than the mistake itself. The mistake is a blip. The response is the story.
Let's really sit with that, because that is profound and it is directly relevant to everything we are teaching today. The way you respond to a mistake in public is infinitely more important than the mistake itself.
When I laughed, when I acknowledged the mistake lightly and moved on, I did several things simultaneously. I diffused the tension in the room. I demonstrated confidence because only a confident person can laugh at themselves. I showed the audience that I was in control, even in a moment of imperfection. And I modeled something really valuable, which is that a mistake is not a catastrophe. It's just a moment that you acknowledge and pass through and leave behind.
And contrast that with the alternative. Imagine if instead of laughing, Lily had frozen. Imagine if she had gone pale, started over-apologizing, lost her thread, stumbled through the rest of the presentation in a distracted, anxious state. The audience would have felt that. The atmosphere would have shifted, and the mistake, which was actually very minor, would have cast a shadow over the entire presentation.
Exactly. The mispronunciation was not the problem. How I reacted to it could have been the problem. Or, as it turned out, it could be the solution.
Now, I want to talk about something else, something that I think is even more interesting than the mistake itself, and that is what happened after the mistake. Because I want to tell you about a specific moment where a stumble turned into a genuine breakthrough for fluency, and I think both Lily and I have experienced versions of this.
Yes. Tell me your version of this, Bruce.
So mine was not as dramatic as a presentation. It was a much smaller, quieter moment. But sometimes the small moments are the ones that change you. I was having a conversation with a native English speaker, someone I knew but did not know very well, and we were talking about something I cared about, something I was genuinely excited about. And in my excitement, I completely forgot to monitor my English. I forgot to edit. I forgot to check and double check. I just talked freely, naturally, with all the enthusiasm I felt.
And what happened?
I made mistakes. I'm sure I made several, but the other person was leaning in. They were engaged. They were responding with energy. They were asking follow-up questions. They were completely caught up in what I was saying. And at the end of the conversation, they said, "You know, your English is really good. You speak with so much passion."
Oh, I love that.
And I remember driving home afterward and thinking, that conversation, where I stopped worrying and just talked, felt different. It felt real. It felt alive in a way that my carefully edited, heavily monitored conversations had never felt. And I realized this is what fluency actually feels like. Not the absence of mistakes, but the presence of genuine expression. The flow state of language, where you are so engaged with what you're communicating that the mechanics become secondary.
And what you're describing, that flow state, is actually a well-documented psychological phenomenon. The psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi defined flow as a state of complete absorption in a challenging activity, where self-consciousness disappears, time passes differently, and performance actually improves. And language, conversation, is one of the domains where people most frequently experience flow.
But you can only access that flow state when you let go of self-monitoring, when you trust the process enough to stop watching yourself from the outside. And that trust comes from what? It comes from doing it, from making the mistakes, from surviving them, from discovering over and over again that they are survivable, that they are small, that they pass.
Which is why our greatest linguistic failures, the coffee shop, the presentation, all the others we haven't told you about, they weren't defeats. They were training. They were moments that, each time we survived them, made us a little less afraid, a little more resilient, a little closer to that flow state.
And I want to say one more thing about this section before we move on to the practical strategies, and it's about the spotlight effect again, but from a slightly different angle.
Go for it.
We talked about how other people don't notice our mistakes as much as we think they do, but I want to flip it around, because I think there's also something else that other people do notice, something that we don't give them enough credit for.
What's that?
They notice the effort. They notice the courage. They notice the person who is trying, who is out there, putting themselves in conversations, reaching across a language barrier, being vulnerable enough to risk imperfection. And they respect it. They feel warmly toward it, because everyone, in some area of their life, knows what it is to be the person who doesn't quite have the right words. And there is a quiet solidarity in that, a recognition.
That is so beautifully said. And it's so true. When I hear someone speaking English with a strong accent, with occasional grammar errors, but with energy and warmth and genuine desire to connect, I don't judge them. I am genuinely moved by them. I think this person is trying. This person cares enough to try. And that is one of the most compelling things you can see in another human being.
Okay, we've talked about the trap. We've busted the myth. We've shared the stories. Now it's time to get practical, because everything we've discussed so far has been setting the stage for the most important part. What do you actually do? When you're in the middle of a conversation and you stumble, what do you do? When the fear spikes, what's the protocol? When you mispronounce something or use the wrong word or blank on vocabulary, what do you do in that moment?
This is the part I am most excited about because this is where real change happens. This is the Resilience Protocol, and it is a collection of specific, actionable, field-tested techniques that you can start using immediately. So stay with us because this is where everything clicks into place. All right, the Resilience Protocol. I want to start by explaining what we mean by this phrase, because resilience is a word that gets used a lot, and I want to make sure we're using it in the specific way it applies to language learning and public communication.
Resilience in psychology refers to the ability to recover from difficulty, to bounce back, to not just survive challenging experiences, but to grow through them. And what we're specifically talking about here is linguistic resilience, the ability to stumble in a conversation, to make a mistake in public, and to recover gracefully without losing your composure, your confidence, or your momentum.
And the reason we call it a protocol rather than just a collection of tips is because a protocol is a system. It's something you internalize and practice until it becomes automatic, so that when the moment of difficulty arrives, when you're in the middle of a sentence and the word you need just isn't there, you don't have to think about what to do. You already know. Your resilience response kicks in automatically.
So let's go through the techniques one by one, and as we go through them, I want you to not just hear them, but really imagine yourself using them, because the more vividly you can picture yourself applying these techniques, the more effectively they'll become available to you in real situations.
Technique number 1, the bridge.
The bridge. This is one of the most immediately useful techniques for recovering mid-sentence without losing your composure. And here's the basic idea. When you lose your train of thought, when you blank on a word, when your sentence is heading in a direction you can't complete, instead of stopping dead, instead of freezing or going silent, you use a bridge.
A bridge is a phrase, usually a short, simple phrase that does two things. First, it buys you time. It keeps the conversation flowing while your brain catches up. And second, it signals to the other person that you are still engaged, still thinking, still present in the conversation. You haven't shut down. You're just bridging to the next thing.
And here's the beautiful thing about bridge phrases in English. Native speakers use them constantly. These are not the linguistic tricks of a struggling second language speaker. These are standard, completely natural features of spoken English. So when you use them, you don't sound like you're struggling. You sound like a natural speaker managing the real-time flow of conversation.
Let me give you some examples, and as I give them, notice how natural they sound. What I'm trying to say is, let me put it another way. How can I put this? Actually, you know what? What I really mean is, so the thing is, I'm looking for the right word here. It's sort of like, bear with me for a second. What's the word I'm looking for? It's on the tip of my tongue.
Did you notice something? Every single one of those phrases is honest. They're not pretending the difficulty isn't happening. They're acknowledging it, naming it, and in naming it, they diffuse it. Because when you say, I'm looking for the right word here, you've told the other person what is happening. You've managed their expectations, and they will almost always respond with patience and even helpfulness.
People love to help fill in the word when someone says, it's on the tip of my tongue. It's actually a collaborative, connecting moment. It pulls the other person in rather than pushing them away.
And here's the recovery pattern that works beautifully with bridge phrases. When you land on the word or the thought you were looking for, or even a close approximation, you use a very simple completion phrase. Something like, "And that's exactly what I mean." And that really captures it. Yeah, something like that. You know what I mean.
That last one, you know what I mean, is particularly powerful because it does something subtle but important. It invites the other person to meet you halfway. It says, I may not have the perfect words, but I trust that you're smart enough to understand what I'm getting at. And most people will rise to that. They will nod, they will say yes, they will complete the thought with you.
Technique number 2, the reframe.
This is a mindset technique, and it's about changing the way you interpret mistakes in real time. We talked earlier about how perfectionism makes you treat every error as evidence of failure. The reframe is the deliberate practice of relabeling that evidence.
Here's the specific cognitive shift. Instead of hearing a mispronounced word as a failure, you hear it as a data point, a piece of information. And here is what that data point tells you.
It tells you that word has not yet been fully integrated into your muscle memory. Your mouth has not yet practiced that specific phonetic pattern enough times to produce it automatically. This is useful information. Now you know. Now you can practice. Now you can improve.
And this reframe is not just a feel-good trick. It is actually scientifically accurate. This is how motor learning works, whether you're learning to type, learning to play the piano, learning a sport, or learning to pronounce sounds in a new language. Every error is your nervous system refining its model of how to perform the action. The error is the feedback. Without the error, there is no refinement.
Think about a baby learning to walk. Every time a baby falls down, that is not a failure. That is the baby's nervous system collecting data on balance, momentum, and center of gravity. And the more the baby falls, the more data it collects, and the more quickly it learns to walk. A baby who never fell would never learn to walk.
And a language learner who never makes mistakes, who avoids all situations where errors might occur, who only speaks when they are absolutely certain they will be correct, that learner is collecting no data. They are practicing nothing. They are developing no fluency.
The mispronounced word, the wrong tense, the fumbled phrase, these are not evidence that you are bad at English. They are evidence that you are actively learning. They are proof that you are out there in the arena doing the work.
So here is how you apply the reframe in a real moment. You mispronounce something, you feel the spike of embarrassment or anxiety, and instead of letting that spike spiral into shame, you mentally say to yourself, and you can actually do this very quickly, very automatically once you practice it, you say, data point. I now know how not to say that. Next time we'll be closer.
Just that. Data point. And then you move on. You don't dwell. You don't replay. You collect the data and you continue.
And over time, this reframe becomes second nature. It becomes your default response to mistakes. And when your default response to mistakes shifts from shame to curiosity, from I failed to I learned, your entire relationship with language learning transforms.
Technique number 3, the mistake quota.
Oh, this one is one of my personal favorites because it turns the whole thing into a game.
The mistake quota is a technique for deliberately gamifying the process of stepping outside your comfort zone. And the basic concept is this. Instead of hoping to get through a conversation without making mistakes, you set a daily or weekly quota for how many mistakes you are going to make.
That's right. You set a goal to make a certain number of mistakes, on purpose, in real situations.
Now, this might sound crazy. Why would you want to make mistakes on purpose? Isn't the goal to reduce mistakes?
That's exactly the misconception we're targeting. Because when you make your goal make fewer mistakes, you naturally become more cautious, more avoidant. You choose safer sentences. You stick to words you are absolutely certain about. You avoid challenging situations. And all of that avoidance shrinks your linguistic comfort zone rather than expanding it.
But when you set a mistake quota, when you say, "Today, my goal is to make 10 mistakes in English," something remarkable happens. Suddenly, every mistake is progress toward your goal. Every stumble is a point on the board. You are no longer trying to avoid mistakes, you are trying to accumulate them.
And the effect this has on your behavior is transformative. You start taking on conversations you would normally avoid. You try out new vocabulary. You attempt more complex sentences. You put yourself in situations that challenge you, because now the challenge is the point.
And what happens when you approach situations with this mindset? You're less anxious because you don't need to perform perfectly. You have permission. You've given yourself explicit permission to mess up. And the irony is that when you're less anxious, your English actually gets better. You stumble less. The conversation flows more naturally. You sometimes find you've used a word correctly that you weren't sure about.
There's a concept in behavioral psychology called exposure therapy, and it's based on the idea that the most effective way to reduce fear is repeated, graduated exposure to the feared situation, not avoidance. Exposure. The more times you place yourself in a situation that previously triggered anxiety, and the more times you survive it, even imperfectly, the less frightening the situation becomes.
The mistake quota is essentially a self-administered version of exposure therapy for language anxiety. Each mistake you collect is another data point that says, "I spoke imperfectly in public and I survived. The world did not end. I am still here, and I'm a little bit stronger than I was."
Now, a practical note on how to implement the mistake quota. Start small. If the idea of making 10 mistakes a day feels overwhelming, start with one. Just one deliberate, intentional linguistic risk per day. Order something at a cafe using a phrase you've never used before. Ask a question using a sentence structure you're not sure about. Introduce yourself using vocabulary that feels slightly above your current level.
And when the mistake happens, when you mispronounce the word or use the wrong preposition or realize mid-sentence that you've constructed something grammatically unusual, celebrate it. Not performatively, not loudly, just internally. Just a quiet acknowledgement. Got one? That counts.
And at the end of the day, look back at your quota. How many did you get? Did you try new things? Did you survive? Of course you did. And then tomorrow, you try again. And gradually, not overnight, but gradually, your comfort zone expands, your repertoire grows, your confidence builds, and the fear shrinks.
Technique number 4. The pause protocol.
This is specifically about what to do in your body, your physical body, when anxiety spikes mid-conversation, because we talked about the biological reality of the social threat response. When anxiety kicks in, your breathing gets shallow, your heart rate spikes, and your prefrontal cortex, the language center, gets partially shut down.
So the pause protocol is a set of physical interventions that directly counteract the stress response. And the first and most powerful of these is something that is almost embarrassingly simple.
Breathe.
Breathe. Specifically, breathe out. Take a slow, controlled exhale, longer than your inhale. Breathing out slowly activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the calming branch of your autonomic nervous system. It sends a direct signal to your brain that says, "We are safe. We are not in danger. Stand down."
And this works. This is not woo-woo. This is basic physiology. A slow exhale, longer than 5 counts, demonstrably reduces heart rate and cortisol levels within seconds. It is one of the fastest tools available to you for managing anxiety in real time.
Now, you can't do a full 5-count exhale in the middle of a sentence without it being obvious. But you can take a shorter, controlled breath at a natural pause point in the conversation. When the other person is speaking, when you're listening, when there's a natural transition, use that moment to breathe deliberately. Ground yourself. Let the calm spread through your body before you speak again.
The second physical technique in the pause protocol is something we call anchoring. This is a concept from NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, and the basic idea is that you can use a physical sensation to anchor yourself to a state of calm and confidence.
The simplest version of this is to feel your feet on the floor. Just notice them. Notice the physical sensation of the ground under your feet. Notice your weight. Notice the texture of the floor through your shoes. This simple act of physical grounding pulls your attention away from the anxious mental spiral and back into your body, into the present moment.
And being in the present moment is crucial for language because language happens in the present. Anxiety, on the other hand, lives in the future, in all the imagined disasters that haven't happened yet. When you ground yourself in the physical present, you pull yourself out of the anxious future and back into the conversation that is actually happening right now.
And the third technique in the pause protocol is what we call strategic pausing. This one is about changing the way you relate to silence in conversation.
Because one of the things that really amplifies anxiety for English learners is the belief that silence is bad, that any gap in speech, any moment where they are not producing words, is a problem that needs to be filled immediately. And so they rush. They say things before they've thought them through. They panic speak. They grab the first word that comes to mind rather than the right one.
But here is a truth about effective communication that completely reframes silence. A thoughtful pause is a sign of intelligence, not incompetence.
Think about the most authoritative, most compelling speakers you have ever heard. Politicians, professors, TED Talk presenters. They pause. They pause deliberately between important ideas. They use silence as punctuation. And those pauses don't undermine their authority. They enhance it. They signal, what I am about to say is worth waiting for.
So instead of fighting the pause, instead of rushing to fill every silence, learn to inhabit it. When you need a moment to find your word, to gather your thought, to take a breath, take it. Just take it. Own the silence. Don't apologize for it. Don't fill it with in a panicked way. Just pause. Look at the other person. Take a breath, and then speak.
And here is a wonderful side effect of strategic pausing. When you pause before saying something important, you naturally give it more weight. The word that comes after a considered pause sounds more deliberate, more chosen. Even if it is a perfectly ordinary word, the pause gives it gravity.
Technique number 5, the curiosity pivot.
I love this one. This is a conversational technique that does double duty. It relieves pressure in a moment of difficulty, and it actually deepens the connection in the conversation.
Here's the situation. You're in a conversation and you hit a wall. You can't think of the word you need, or you realize you don't know enough about the topic to continue in the direction you were going. Or you've made an error and you can feel the blush creeping up your neck and you just need to take some pressure off.
The curiosity pivot is simple. You redirect the conversation to the other person by asking them a genuine question.
Not a fake question. Not a stalling tactic. A genuine question. Something that you are actually curious about in relation to what is being discussed.
And this works for so many reasons. First, it takes the pressure off you. You are now the listener, not the speaker. Your brain gets a brief rest from the strenuous work of producing English in real time.
Second, people love talking about themselves and their own experiences. If you ask someone a genuine question about their opinion or their experience, they will typically respond with warmth and at length. And while they're talking, you are recalibrating. You're finding your footing again. You're preparing for your next contribution.
Third, and this is beautiful, the curiosity pivot makes you a better conversationalist. Because so many people, in their anxiety about speaking, forget to listen. They are so preoccupied with what they're going to say next that they barely absorb what the other person is saying. The curiosity pivot forces you to genuinely listen, and genuine listening, rare, careful, attentive listening, is one of the most attractive qualities a person can have in a conversation.
Some phrases for the curiosity pivot. What about you? What do you think? That's interesting. Have you experienced something similar? I'm curious. How did that make you feel? What's your take on that? I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
And notice something about those phrases. They're not just time fillers, they're invitations. They open the conversation up, they signal to the other person that you are interested in them, not just in presenting yourself to them. And that signal is worth gold in any relationship, personal or professional.
Before we move into our final section, I want to say something that I think ties all of these techniques together.
Go ahead.
All of these techniques, the bridge, the reframe, the mistake quota, the pause protocol, the curiosity pivot, they share a common thread. And that thread is this. They all require you to be kind to yourself. They all require you to approach your own mistakes with patience and even affection rather than with judgment and shame.
And that kindness to yourself, what psychologists call self-compassion, is not just a nice to have. It is actually one of the most powerful predictors of language learning success. Research by psychologists Kristen Neff and others has shown that people who practice self-compassion, who treat themselves with the same warmth and understanding they would offer a good friend, are more resilient after failures, more willing to try again, and more persistent in the face of difficulty.
Because when you believe deep down that making a mistake makes you a failure, you will avoid making mistakes at all costs. But when you believe that making a mistake makes you a learner, when you treat yourself as someone who is worthy of patience and encouragement, you become willing to try. And trying is everything.
By the way, if this lesson is resonating with you, if you're finding these ideas useful and encouraging, we'd love for you to like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Maybe someone you know who is learning English and struggling with this exact fear. Your share could make a real difference for them. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel. We create English learning content that is designed to be genuinely useful and genuinely human. We'd love to have you as part of our community.
And if you'd like even more English listening and speaking practice, make sure to check out our podcast playlist right here on this channel. You'll find so many valuable lessons that are specifically designed to help you improve your English naturally through real conversation, real stories, and real teaching. The link is in the description below.
Okay, we are heading into our final section, and this is the one that in some ways brings everything together. Because we've talked about the trap of perfectionism, we've talked about the myth of the textbook standard, we've shared our failures, we've given you the resilience protocol, but now we want to talk about what's on the other side of all of this. What does it actually look like to master fluid communication, and what does that mean for your English learning journey going forward?
Fluid communication. What a phrase. What does it actually mean?
Let's start by defining it. And let's start by saying what it's not, because I think a lot of English learners have an implicit definition of good English speaker that is actually quite wrong, and it's worth surfacing that definition and examining it.
For many learners, good English speaker means someone who speaks accurately, someone with a neutral accent, someone who never makes grammatical errors, someone who always chooses the precise, correct vocabulary, someone who produces clean, structured sentences.
And sure, those are nice qualities to have, but here's a question for you. Think of the most memorable conversation you've had in your life, in any language. The conversation that stuck with you, the one that moved you, the one you still think about.
Was it memorable because the other person's grammar was perfect?
Almost certainly not. It was memorable because of how it made you feel, because of the ideas that were exchanged, because of the humor, or the emotion, or the vulnerability, or the insight, because of the sense of genuine connection between two human beings.
And that is what fluid communication is really about. It is not about accuracy. It is about authentic emotional connection. It is about reaching across the space between two people and genuinely touching something real.
And the incredibly important thing to understand is that accuracy and connection are not the same thing. They are not even particularly well correlated. Some of the most accurate speakers, the most grammatically precise, the most perfectly pronounced, are strangely cold in conversation. There's something mechanical about them, something that doesn't quite land, because their attention is on the language rather than on the person.
And some of the most powerful, most compelling, most connected communicators in the world speak with all sorts of imperfections, accents, colloquialisms, occasional grammar tangles, but they are so genuinely present, so truly engaged with the person in front of them that none of it matters. The imperfections become invisible, or better, the imperfections become part of their charm.
Let's talk about this directly. Why does vulnerability in speech actually build faster rapport than robotic precision?
This is something I find endlessly fascinating, and it connects to what psychologists call the pratfall effect. The pratfall effect was first described by psychologist Elliot Aronson, and the basic finding is this. When someone who is perceived as competent makes a small blunder, their likability actually increases. Their mistake makes them more human, more relatable, more approachable.
And the application to language is clear. When you speak with perfect, robotic precision, when you never stumble, never falter, never show any sign of the human messiness of real-time thought, there's a certain distance, a certain unapproachability. You seem polished, perhaps, but you don't seem real.
But when you speak with genuine expression, even with imperfect mechanics, when the other person can see you reaching for a word, can feel your effort, can hear the personality and warmth in your voice, they feel something. They feel the reality of you. And human beings are wired at a very deep level to respond to realness.
Think about the way children speak. Children don't speak with precision. They make up words, they mangle pronunciation, they use grammar in wildly creative and incorrect ways. And yet, children are often the most compelling communicators in the world because they are completely authentic. They say exactly what they feel, with total commitment, with zero self-consciousness. And that authenticity is irresistible.
Now, I'm not suggesting that you speak like a toddler, but I am suggesting that you hold on to that quality of total commitment to what you're trying to say. That quality of caring so much about the meaning, about the idea, about the connection, that the mechanics become secondary.
So how do you shift the focus from accurate vocabulary to authentic emotional connection? Let me give you some really concrete, practical ways to do this.
The first one is speak to the feeling, not just the fact.
When native speakers, or any fluid communicators, talk about something, they don't just convey information. They convey how they feel about that information. They share their emotional relationship to what they're saying. And this emotional content is actually what the other person's brain responds to most strongly.
If you're talking about a trip you took, don't just list the places you visited. Tell me how the air smelled when you stepped off the plane. Tell me the moment you felt most alive. Tell me what surprised you. Tell me what you wish you could have stayed forever. That is the content that makes a story real. That is the content that creates connection.
And here's the beautiful thing about emotional language. It is often simpler than technical or precise language. You don't need a large vocabulary to describe how something felt. It was incredible is simpler than almost any technical description, and it conveys more.
The second concrete way to shift toward authentic connection is use your body.
Communication is not just words. It never has been. Research by psychologist Albert Mehrabian, although this research is often oversimplified and misquoted, has highlighted the enormous role of nonverbal communication in how we perceive and connect with each other. Your posture, your gestures, your facial expressions, your eye contact, these communicate constantly in parallel with your words.
And here's the relevance for language learners. When your verbal communication is imperfect, when you're struggling for a word or your grammar isn't quite right, your nonverbal communication can carry so much of the weight. If you are making eye contact, if you are leaning in slightly, if your face is expressive and engaged, if your gestures match your meaning, people will follow you. They will understand you. Even when your words are imperfect, your body is telling a complete and compelling story.
And there's a wonderful feedback loop here. When you use your body expressively, when you gesture, when you use your face, when you're physically engaged, you actually feel more confident. The body influences the mind. Power poses, open postures, expansive gestures, research by Amy Cuddy and others has suggested that physical expression of confidence can feed back into your psychological experience of confidence.
In other words, if you stand and speak like you're confident, even before you feel confident, you start to feel it. You literally trick your brain into a state of greater ease and fluency.
The third way to shift toward authentic connection, find and build on common ground.
The deepest, most effortless conversations happen between people who feel they have something in common, a shared experience, a shared interest, a shared feeling. And one of the most powerful skills in fluid communication is the ability to find that common ground quickly and to build on it.
And this is actually a skill that levels the playing field for language learners, because finding common ground doesn't require perfect English. It requires genuine curiosity about the other person. It requires asking good questions, simple questions, and listening carefully to the answers. And then it requires the courage to share your own experience in return, imperfectly if necessary, but authentically.
I know exactly what you mean. 4 simple words that can create an instant bond. That happened to me too. 5 words that bridge any gap. Tell me more about that. 4 words that signal genuine interest. These are not linguistically complex phrases, but in the hands of someone who means them sincerely, they are extraordinarily powerful.
Okay, we're approaching the final part of our conversation, and I want to make sure we talk about something really important, the reality of high-pressure social interactions, because I think everything we've discussed gives you a solid foundation for handling everyday conversational English. But what about the really high-stakes moments? The job interview, the important presentation, the first date, the conversation with someone you deeply want to impress.
Because those moments don't get easier automatically. The principles we've been discussing all apply, but high-pressure situations have some specific additional dynamics that are worth addressing directly.
The first thing I want to say about high-pressure situations is this: preparation is your best friend. And not the kind of preparation that looks like trying to memorize every possible thing you might say. That kind of preparation makes you more rigid, not more confident.
The kind of preparation that actually helps is preparation that focuses on your core message. What is the one thing, the most important thing, that you want this person to understand or feel or know about you in this interaction? If you can identify that one core message and feel genuinely connected to it, you have an anchor, a home base. No matter how the conversation goes, no matter how many wrong words you use or how many times you stumble, you can always return to that core message.
Think of it like a GPS. You might take a wrong turn. The GPS doesn't panic. It doesn't say, "We're lost, everything is ruined." It just calmly recalculates. It finds a new route to the same destination. Your core message is your destination. You will get there. The exact route doesn't.
The second thing I want to say about high-pressure situations is slow down.
This is so counterintuitive when you're anxious, because anxiety makes you want to rush. It makes you want to get through the terrifying experience as quickly as possible. But rushing is one of the worst things you can do for your English.
When you slow down, when you consciously choose to speak more slowly than your anxiety is pushing you to, several good things happen. Your pronunciation improves because you have more time to form the sounds correctly. Your grammar improves because you have more processing time. You sound more confident because deliberate, measured speech is one of the hallmarks of confident people. And you give your listener more time to understand you, which means fewer misunderstandings and fewer of those confused looks that can spike your anxiety further.
If you think you're speaking too slowly, you're probably speaking at exactly the right pace. We almost always overestimate how fast we need to talk to seem intelligent. The reality is that clear, measured speech always sounds smarter than rushed, blurted speech.
The third thing about high-pressure situations, and this is the one I want to leave you with as our final main point, is to shift your attention outward.
This is the master key. This is the thing that, when you truly internalize it, changes everything.
In a high-pressure situation, all of our attention is naturally directed inward. We are monitoring ourselves, watching ourselves, evaluating ourselves. And that inward focus is precisely what creates the anxiety, the stiffness, the lack of fluency.
The antidote, the technique, is to deliberately, consciously shift your attention outward, to the other person, to their face, their expression, their body language, what they need from this conversation, how they're responding, what they're feeling.
When you are truly focused on the other person, truly curious about them, truly engaged with their experience, you don't have mental bandwidth left to be anxious about yourself. The self-consciousness requires a certain amount of attention to sustain. When you redirect that attention to the other person, the self-consciousness simply can't survive.
And the beautiful paradox is that when you stop thinking about how you sound better. When you stop worrying about your English improves. When you stop monitoring yourself and start genuinely connecting with the other person, everything becomes more natural.
Because you are doing what language was designed to do. You are using it as a bridge between your inner world and someone else's. And in that moment of genuine connection, the question of whether the bridge is perfectly constructed becomes completely irrelevant. What matters is that someone crossed it, that you met, that something real was exchanged.
That is what fluency really means. Not perfection, not precision, but the ability to build that bridge. And you can build it with the English you have right now, today, imperfectly, beautifully, humanly.
I have loved this conversation today, Bruce.
Me too. I genuinely have. Because I think this is the kind of conversation that doesn't happen enough in English learning spaces. There's so much focus on grammar, on vocabulary, on pronunciation drills, on exam preparation, and all of those things have value, but the fear, the thing that actually stops people from using all that knowledge in real life, that doesn't get talked about nearly enough.
And the fear is real. We are not dismissing it. We are not saying it's irrational or silly. We are saying it's human and understandable and completely workable. And we are saying that on the other side of the fear, on the other side of the mistake, the stumble, the mispronunciation, the blank moment, there is something truly wonderful.
There is connection. There is growth. There is the living, breathing, ever-expanding experience of a language becoming yours.
All right, we are at the end of our conversation today, and I want to take a few minutes to bring it all home because we've covered a lot of ground, and I want to make sure you leave with a clear sense of what you've learned and, more importantly, what you can do with it.
Let's start with a quick summary. What did we talk about today?
We started with the trap of perfectionism. We explored how high-stakes environments trigger the social threat response, how the psychological drain of internal editing creates cognitive overload, and how the obsession with being flawless actually stunts the natural acquisition processes that lead to real fluency.
Then, we looked at the myth of the textbook standard. We contrasted the rigid, cleaned-up version of English taught in classrooms with the messy, rhythmic, intentional language that real people actually use every day. We talked about how native speakers prioritize flow and meaning over perfect syntax. And we placed all of this in the context of 2026, a world where AI has fundamentally shifted the value proposition of human communication toward warmth, personality, and genuine connection.
Then we got personal. We shared our own greatest linguistic failures, the coffee shop, the presentation, the moments that felt like disasters. We deconstructed the spotlight effect and showed you why other people notice your mistakes far less than you think they do. And we talked about the specific moment when a stumble becomes a breakthrough, when the response to a mistake transforms its meaning entirely.
Then we gave you the resilience protocol, 5 concrete, practical techniques.
The bridge, for recovering mid-sentence without losing your composure. The reframe, for hearing your mistakes as data points rather than failures. The mistake quota, for gamifying your linguistic risk-taking and expanding your comfort zone. The pause protocol, for managing the physical reality of anxiety in real time. The curiosity pivot, for redirecting conversations and deepening connection simultaneously.
And then we talked about what it really means to master fluid communication. That it's not about accurate vocabulary, but about authentic emotional connection. That vulnerability in speech builds faster rapport than robotic precision. And that the master key in any high-pressure situation is to shift your attention outward to the other person and to trust that the bridge you're building, even if imperfect, is enough.
And now I want to say something to you directly, not as a teacher, not as someone who has figured everything out, but as a fellow language learner, a fellow human being who has been exactly where you are.
Go ahead, Lilly.
The fear you feel is real, and it is valid, and it comes from a very natural, very human place. You are not weak for feeling it. You are not broken. You are not failing. You are brave, because learning a language, genuinely learning it, putting it out into the world, using it in real situations with real people who can judge you and misunderstand you and occasionally confuse you, that is one of the bravest things a person can do. It requires showing up as yourself, imperfectly, in a world that sometimes seems to prefer perfection.
And here's what I want you to take away from today. Every single mistake you make in English is a brick in the wall of your fluency. Every stumble is a step. Every mispronounced word is a data point. Every blank moment, every fumbled sentence, every conversation that didn't go the way you hoped, all of it is the work. All of it is the process. And the process is the point.
You don't have to be perfect. You have never needed to be perfect. What you need to be is present and willing and kind to yourself. And the English? The English comes. It always comes. Not smoothly at first, not without its wobbles and detours, but it comes.
So here is your challenge for this week. Pick one situation, just one, where you have been avoiding using English because of the fear. Maybe there's a conversation you've been putting off, a question you've been afraid to ask, a situation you've been steering around.
And go do it. Not because it will go perfectly, it might not, but because doing it is the practice. Because surviving the imperfect conversation is how you build the resilience. Because on the other side of that fear is a better, more fluent, more confident version of you, patiently waiting for you to show up.
And we will be here. Every video, every lesson, every conversation, we will be here, walking this journey alongside you. Because we believe in what you're doing. We believe in you.
If today's conversation was valuable to you, if something clicked, if you felt seen, if you found a tool here that you're going to actually use, then please take a moment right now to like this video and share it with someone you know who is learning English. Your share means the world to us, and it means even more to the person you share it with, who might need to hear exactly this message today.
And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new lesson. We publish regular content designed specifically for English learners who want to improve their communication skills in a real, human, practical way.
And one more thing, if you'd like even more English listening and speaking practice beyond what we share in these videos, make absolutely sure you check out our podcast playlist here on this channel. We have built that playlist with you in mind, with lessons that flow naturally, conversations that feel real, and English that sounds the way English actually sounds in the world. The link is in the description below and it's pinned in the comments. Go check it out.
You know, Lily, I said at the beginning of this conversation that this topic might be the most important thing we've discussed on this channel, and I stand by that. Because every other lesson we teach, every grammar point, every vocabulary session, every pronunciation guide, it all depends on this. It all depends on the willingness to open your mouth and try. And that willingness comes from exactly what we've been talking about today, the courage to be imperfect.
And you have that courage. You always have. You just needed someone to remind you that it was there.
So go out there, make your mistakes, collect your data points, use your bridges and your reframes and your curiosity pivots. Slow down, breathe. Look at the person in front of you and say what you mean, even if it doesn't come out perfectly, because perfectly is not the goal.
Connection is the goal. Growth is the goal. Being real is the goal.